The AfD wants to deport migrants from Germany. Still, quite a few German Turks vote for the AfD and even sympathize with the party. Isn't that surprising? We are in the middle of Kreuzberg today to discuss this with our guests.
The digital social space is, and I say this in all earnest, the new battlefield for democracy in the long run.
I often talk with my migrant friends who are doctors, who are educated, and who actually vote for the AfD.
There is also racism from Muslims towards Syrians or from Turks towards Syrians and Africans.
Everyone is moving towards the right. Even Scholz talks about deporting on a large scale.
Population forecast shows that half of the country will be made up of people from a migration background by 2030.
Welcome to Germany's very first migrant-centered political talk show with me, Nalan, Sipar, here in Kreuzberg. Today we want to discuss the AfD and explore the question of why a significant number of German Turks feel a sense of sympathy towards the party. I have invited numerous guests to join us, and one of them is Andre. Welcome, Andre. You were once drawn to the party and even became a member of the AfD. Why did you join?
Why? It was around 2013. Back then the AfD was all about economic policy. That was the main platform. Many professors supported it and joined. In fact, it was called the Professors' Party. It focused on the euro and new debt. Especially back then it was about Greece, but also about Spain, Italy and other countries. So that was the reason I joined. The FDP had also gotten kicked out of the Bundestag during this time. I would say this also piqued my interest in the AfD. My thought was a new economic party is gaining strength and would probably replace the FDP.
But you later left as well. What was the reason for that?
At some point, I noticed tendencies leaning towards radicalization. The political issues moved away from the economy and more towards migration. From my perspective, it was no longer about valid political criticisms of migration or integration, it was something else. The discourse became very aggressive and sharp tones were eventually adopted, and there was a point after the 2015 Party Congress in Essen that I could no longer support it.
That was a problem. And actually, in the years before, it was always the SPD that the German Turks voted for. Orkan, you are from the SPD. How do you explain that in the last European elections, so many SPD voters, specifically a total of 580,000, switched to the AfD?
The SPD is fundamentally a party that represents a broad segment of the population and also aims to represent them. That includes many conservatives. This is not a new insight. However, it is important to note, in the context of the European elections, is that they were greatly overshadowed by national politics. The traffic light coalition paid the price at the polls. That's how I explain the migration of voters.
Not only was the traffic light coalition punished, but also the CDU, where you, Emitis, were a member for a long time. It lost many voters to the AfD, more than the SPD even, 620,000. Why do you think it took an even harder hit?
I believe that the AfD grew large because of the CDU. It all started back in I often lay the blame with the CDU. It has made plenty mistakes. I mean, they can oppose the traffic light coalition as loud as they want and as often as they want. But at the end of the day, the CDU owns a big share in these losses. There are also many protest voters who have gone to the AfD or to other parties because they simply no longer agree with the ones they have always voted for.
What do you think was the biggest mistake the CDU has made?
Back when Mrs. Merkel actually acted correctly for humanitarian reasons. Germans, even some from migrant backgrounds, accused her of having opened and unchecked borders, letting everyone in indiscriminately. And many blamed Merkel for that, and rightfully so. I think, as a former member of the CDU, I am in favor of allowing migration and immigration, but with common sense. But unfortunately, some of it happened without any common sense at all.
Okay, did Mrs. Merkel open the borders?
No, Mrs. Merkel did not open the borders. We are in the Schengen area of the European Union. The borders were already open. She just didn't close the borders, which would have been illegal. That's why I find this myth told by people from the CDU and also from the AfD that Merkel opened the borders completely wrong. This creates false narratives and racist stories that simply do not reflect the facts. They don't match the reality.
But were the borders then controlled?
So checks were carried out everywhere and always within the Schengen framework. But of course, the Schengen area is free of certain controls. That's a good thing about the European Union. There can be free-flowing traffic of people and products. Getting from point A to point B, so to speak, is quite easy. Goods have always circulated freely, and it has always been the same for people. And with that comes occasional controls at the borders.
Specifically, why did so many refugees and migrants come to Germany and not other European countries? Most of them were here. How do you explain that?
Well, people flee and go where they have social ties, where they have family, where there is democracy and rule of law. And that exists in Germany. That's why I think that's why many people have come here. But most people who flee go to neighboring countries like Syria, Turkey and elsewhere, rather than Germany.
Özgür, as a scientist, you see things from a broader perspective. In a moment, we will get to what motivates people of migrant background to vote for the AfD. But first, let's pivot to the upcoming national elections. They will take place in a year and a half. An added factor will be our new citizenship law, which will most likely introduce a new group of voters to the process. What's your view? How is it that these other parties aren't able to attract unsatisfied protest voters? And why are they losing members to the AfD?
First of all, before I answer this question, I would like to say something here. There are, of course, many people who, in the early years of the AfD, had a false connection between the economically liberal forces, those who wanted to represent German interests from an economically liberal position, and those who, very early on, had an anti-migration party in mind. Moreover, they really wanted a racist anti-migration party, and that was a consensus fiction which quickly broke apart. The differences were magnified by the migration in summer 2015. It was indeed very interesting, and this radicalization, it hasn't stopped. So after 2015, the radicalization has been forcefully and continuously advancing. I think it is very important to put this into context again. And in fact, comparative political science actually shows that the central shift, the main reason for voting AfD, is not protest but conviction with the platform and its policies. And that makes the party more dangerous. Of course, there are people, I do not deny, who also vote for the AfD out of protest because they want to send a message to the traffic light coalition or other governments, but the majority is indeed convinced by the platform and its policies. And that makes it even more dangerous for us because we know these people are actually supportive of what the AfD stands for. And that is indeed a bigger problem for social peace. Now I have a wasp here.
We are here in Kreuzberg. Anything can happen here.
In Kreuzberg there are quite a lot of wasps around.
The original point was that there is now a new group of potential voters, a very new group of voters. If I am not mistaken, approximately 14% of foreigners could now become voters with this new law in place. Do you think that migrants and immigrants could soon be a significant game changer?
That is suspected. There is this impression that they could tip the scales. It is expected that in the next federal election, 15% of voters, that number depends on the speed of the naturalization process, that 15% of the electorate will have a migration background. Looking back at past federal elections, we see the results have been tightly contested, increasingly so. Especially the one in Berlin was very, very close in the last election, and the federal elections overall were close. Which means 15% is indeed significant voter potential. So it actually makes sense for democratic parties to actively and proactively seek these votes, and unfortunately we see no evidence that democratic parties are doing this. This is much more intensively pursued by the AfD.
We were here in Kreuzberg, walking around and asking people why they feel a sense of sympathy for the AfD, and if they could envision or even explain why their acquaintances sympathize with the AfD. Here's their responses.
Because they feel more like Germans or locals now, and no longer like foreigners. That's it. And nowadays, there really are a large number of foreigners in Germany. Let's put it this way, you can see it in politics, how things look now, also in Hamburg with all the demonstrations, and now we are seeing the face of integration changing. It is no longer what we used to see with it and everything associated with it. How should one best describe it? Yes, all the guest workers who came here also helped to build Germany, but they had different values. There was no such thing as we're creating a caliphate here or anything like that. Back then, everything was still about living together in unity and all that, but now, unfortunately, it is the case that opinions have naturally changed over time. People want to send many foreigners back again, especially those who cannot behave properly. Nowadays, to be honest, many are also very antisocial. That just doesn't fit at all. They behave terribly and refuse to adapt to the norms. They live here as if they were still in a foreign country, following their own rules, and that has absolutely nothing to do with proper integration. I think there is also an additional form of racism among migrants. It is not just about Germans versus Turks. I think there is also intolerance and an additional form of racism among migrants. I believe that people with a migration background are no exception, and I mean, if the right wing tries to address the material problems of the people and the bourgeois center fails to do so, then people will end up voting for the AfD, because they are the ones who talk about class, poverty, exploitation, and so on. Even if it sounds very simple, it seems to be an alternative. So, I don't want to say that fascism is an option, but it appears to be considered as one. I'm just saying we can't keep saying, oh yes, the AfD are the bad ones. Instead, we must address the problem at its root and truly understand it. I don't believe that being affected necessarily means having a political opinion. I think there are also many women or queer people in the AfD. Their policies are anti-queer and anti-women, which is a major problem. Having a migration background doesn't mean you are necessarily more radical or more politically correct in your views. I believe they see that. But I think they see that they identify more with this part of this, the national identity with the definition of Germany and what that means, than with the others. There always have to be the bad migrants who are blamed for us not having a good life here. They are often scapegoated for our problems. I have been here for 7 years, as someone who came from Turkey. When you take a look at the party platforms or the posters, you will see that they are entirely against us and our way of life in its entirety. I cannot comprehend that. There were discussions and debates about the remigration. Even people who were born here and possess a German passport are supposed to have their passports and citizenship revoked and be deported. I cannot understand that. It is extremely absurd.
Andre, what do you think about these responses?
We are witnessing something very interesting. I remember as a child being out and about and hearing adults say things like, yeah man, the Turks, they come and get everything here, and the Poles, they get everything. Those were phrases I heard as a child. It sounds absurd to me now when I hear people with a migration background saying the same thing. The Syrians get everything. I had to work for it. Something is repeating itself. But it also shows, I believe, and perhaps this is a valuable lesson, that regardless of the direction, whether it be towards the right or the left, there are many people who have integrated. So consider this. We're talking about individuals from a migrant's background who came to this country 15, 20, 30 years or possibly even longer ago, who now say, wow, I feel so integrated, but now I worry about myself. Is it possible that what I have worked for, what I have created here, can, in quotation marks, be taken away from me? And in my view, the AfD certainly manipulates these fears in a very populist way. They exploit them. And now they seem to be succeeding in gaining interest from people who have a migration background, who are now concerned. I find this alarming. Now the politicians, especially those from the Traffic Light Coalition, are obligated to act as well from the CDU. It is their duty to respond. The opposition must now ensure that this course changes among people with migration backgrounds to regain their trust.
What's your impression of the responses, Emitis?
To be honest, I think it is foolish for so many people who give such answers. Because if we look around, many people are integrated here. And I often talk to migrant friends of mine who are doctors, who are educated, and who actually vote for the AfD. This is because they think that we are not even noticed, that we are not truly accepted here. On the one hand, they say we want to leave Germany. And if AfD comes, we will have to go. But in reality, we can no longer return to the home of our ancestors. So we just go unnoticed. They don't feel we are taken seriously. And they are simply dissatisfied with the refugee policy, with integration and migration policy, especially with the Traffic Light Coalition. If I may say so, publicly, I think Ms. Wagenknecht is doing the right thing. She is taking the AfD apart, while the other parties keep bashing the AfD. Instead of focusing on the exact points and concentrating on them to build their election platform, they just keep on attacking the AfD. and I do not think that is effective. And that's why I believe that Ms. Wagenknecht's policy is good, that she tries to divide the AfD. There should definitely be more such tactical approaches.
Ms. Wagenknecht is a former member of parliament. A member of your party, Olaf. What do you think?
I see it differently, to be honest. She ran with the statement that she wants to attract voters from the AfD. But we saw in the European elections that she mainly attracted voters from the SPD, the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, and also from the CDU, but not much from the AfD. Therefore, for what she set out to do, she did not achieve it. She rather split the progressive left-wing camp. And from my perspective, Wagenknecht addresses many migration policy demands that are far to the right of the CDU stance. She criticizes Pfizer for allegedly promoting the smuggling industry. Meanwhile, the Traffic Light Coalition has just passed one repatriation law after another, recently in the cabinet at the end of June. So in that respect, I have a lot of criticism of Sarah Wagenknecht, and was also one of the internal opponents of her anti-refugee positions, and therefore, I believe she contributes to the narrative that refugees are the scapegoats and so on, instead of putting the social question much more at the center, because many people have fears of decline, and that must be addressed appropriately. But not by saying, yes, the others are taking something away from us, because the services of general interest, the schools, everything were already dilapidated and destroyed by the debt break, by the Black Zero policy, and that is the problem. Therefore, I think it is bad that she tells this story, which only strengthens the right. We saw this in the European elections. Everyone has moved right. Even Scholz talks about large-scale deportations. And the GEAS, the Common European Asylum System, was agreed upon and adopted. So politics has overall shifted further to the right. This has only strengthened the right, and that is a mistake. Therefore, we should stick to the democratic consensus, an open migration policy, equal rights for all. And I believe that would be the right path, and not the further shift to the right, which unfortunately Wagenknecht is also doing in my view.
When I talk to people here in Kreuzberg, they say, I'm paying a lot more for heating now than last year. I'm doing badly financially. I'm scared. There are indeed fears of decline. And when it comes to social issues, people usually think of the SPD. Orkan, here we have a chancellor quoted on the cover of Spiegel saying, we must deport on a large scale. How did you feel when you saw that particular cover?
Firstly, it doesn't matter how I felt. I care about facts. Therefore, when considering the proposal for mass deportation, it is important to note that the suggested figure of 300,000 individuals being required to leave is factually inaccurate.
Because the actual number of people who can really be deported is between 40 and 50,000. Now I ask, what will change socially and economically in this country if we deport these 40 to 50,000 people who are mostly under 30 years old? So, the workforce, potential workforce, how would that change the general situation of those remaining if we deport these 40 to 50,000 individuals? This is a phantom debate which in my opinion is not worthy of social democrats, truly. And it is a mystery to me personally what the social democrats in the federal government hope to achieve with this. When they validate the discourse of right-wing extremists, and to me, the AfD is a neo-Nazi nationalist party indeed, with a delay of 1 to 2 years in their theses being confirmed.
I believe this does not advance our country. I recommend that my comrades at the federal level to reconsider, perhaps to refocus on social justice, redistribution, and similar issues.
So, you just nodded. I would like to come to you and ask why you nodded, if I may. It must also be said that when we speak of the majority population, we're referring to the so-called bio-Germans. Fear is a natural response to the unknown. Of course, what people don't know is often something they fear. In fact, studies show that people are particularly afraid in the new federal states, where hardly any migrants actually live. I sometimes ponder how we, as a migrant journalist, and you all with diverse backgrounds, should actually handle this situation. What actions can we take, Özgür, to alleviate or remove the fear from these people? How can this be achieved?
That is, of course, the 500 billion euro question for this country and many other Western societies. For East Germany, it is certainly very important, as there has been for several decades, this theory or assumption that bio-Germans who have more interaction with people of migrant backgrounds are likely to have fewer prejudices. We certainly are not going to conduct a social experiment that brings people from A to B so that they can have contact with each other, but what we obviously have to do as a nation is strengthen civil society. So In places where the state does not reach, there is civil society, there are migrant communities who have been doing incredibly valuable and important work for many years and are now being severely threatened by attacks from the far-right extremist fringe, which attacks very important and essential federal programs, so that civil society, which works daily on the ground against racism and anti-Semitism, provides counseling. Engaging in community service is crucial. It involves establishing sports clubs where various activities, including soccer and basketball, take place. Additionally, students can seek assistance with their homework in these clubs, and that is where we must take action as a whole society, where resources must be distributed in order to ensure the daily preservation and promotion of social peace and cohesion. Ongoing efforts are essential on the ground.
I believe everyone can do something in their own area. For me as a journalist, it is clear I want to talk to the community. I also want to inform them. Even topics like remigration are repeatedly brought up by the AfD. And when I talk to people here at Kotti, they say, yes, they just want to deport the Syrians. They surely won't deport us, right? Is that correct? Andre, how would you phrase it? You were with the AfD, weren't you?
Yes, that's right.
I think they will believe you most of all since they know you were in the AfD. Does the AfD really mean that? Do they just want to deport the Syrian refugees and then everything will be fine?
I don't want to defend the AfD here, but I need to say something briefly, or I would like to mention it right now. When conversing with my Turkish friends, it becomes evident that the issue I'm highlighting isn't limited to only a few individuals. Germans exhibit racism towards Muslims, while in turn, Muslims display xenophobia towards Syrians. Similarly, Turks also harbor prejudices against Syrians and Africans. This is a type of racism we must also highlight. So, within the community of people with migrant backgrounds, there are also racist tendencies towards each other, not just from Germans towards foreigners. This is a crucial point that is seldom discussed, ultimately causing these individuals to support the AfD during elections. So there is a reason they say, well, if they are now against the Syrians, maybe someone from my view says, then that is my party, yes, and then that also has a racist background.
We were discussing the reasons and motives why migrants, including German Turks, find themselves sympathizing with the AfD. And one of the answers was also that the refugees would not work. They would all receive government aid. Ukrainians would receive a lot of state aid.
And you also demand online that refugees should be made to work and contribute. Not just refugees, but also long-term unemployed Germans should work. We have such a labor shortage here, and that cannot be. We have the skilled workers, and we want to bring in more immigrants. Why? Why don't we support them? 1 million Ukrainians, we take care of 300 of them. They all don't want to work. They tell us to our faces, I get money from the job center, I prefer to work illegally. That's their statement. And now comes the politicians. What do they say?
I can say something about that because I have had a different experience. The majority of refugees, which includes Ukrainians and others, have a genuine desire to find employment. As an example, my mother had to endure a lengthy wait of 10 years before her university degree was recognized in Germany. We have a major issue with professional recognition. The language level is often set very high. The processes take a long time. There are work bans. There are many areas where improvements can be made. Currently, there are many people, such as those from Ukraine, more than 200,000, and the number is rising, who are in jobs with social security. There are around 50,000 people engaged in minor employment. They are also willing to complete small jobs as long as they are able to work. Their goal is to settle down and have a stable source of income. Hence, it is incorrect to claim otherwise.
That means it's the politicians' fault, as we put obstacles in our own way. With our certification, with our recognition, darn it, if someone can paint, then they can go paint. I don't need recognition for that, and it's the politicians' fault. It's not the entrepreneurs' fault nor the refugees' fault, it's the politicians' fault. And here are two politicians.
We are state-level politicians who have been advocating for years that changes are needed. But we must, please, my request to this group, let's discuss based on evidence and facts. 84% of Syrian men are employed. Among the native Germans, the employment rate is 83%. This means the percentage of working Syrians is higher than that of native Germans. These are the facts. So, there you go.
Moreover, there are facts about those who came seeking protection in 2015. We have a rate of about 80%. After 6 years in 2021, they were in jobs with social security. This means after 6 years, they were working. This means they completed their training in the meantime. That means if we had managed to organize it, if we had a sensible migration administration, then it would have been accomplished more quickly. Then perhaps they might have already been in these professions by the years. But that is mainly due to the fact that the far right exerts massive pressure on the democratic parties, and they unfortunately allow themselves to be driven into an anti-migration rhetoric, so that exactly what should happen does not actually become reality. Specifically, the individuals arriving genuinely desire to be productive. In addition, there could be around 50, 100, or perhaps 2,000 individuals who lack the desire to do so. But the majority wants to work, they want to build a new life for themselves, and every person who goes to another country has, or a large portion has, a very high aspiration to succeed. I am present and my intention is to construct something for my family. These individuals possess that and they exhibit it. When we facilitate it for them, they accomplish it at a more accelerated pace. And we have this on one hand for these people, but there is also data for people who did not come as refugees but came as qualified individuals. And there we are in a comparison of 52 countries internationally. And as Germany, we ended up in 49th place. That means, unfortunately, this country is not attractive for people who come here to find employment.
And you mean skilled workers?
Exactly.
Based on my own personal experience, let me share that when I turned 15, my family relocated to Germany and we stayed at a refugee home. The main priority for my parents upon arrival was finding employment opportunities. My father was a teacher and his diploma was not recognized for years. And of course, being in a foreign country, you need money, even to call people back in Turkey. Perhaps this can be a bit of an issue at the moment, considering that I am speaking based on my own experiences as the current moderator of this discussion. But my observation was also that people actually want to work. On the other hand, they are hindered by a CDU district administrator. We reached out to the source. He demands that refugees must work for 80 cents per hour, which is quite low. These are also inhumane positions. At least I think so. But Özgür, you just mentioned the skilled workers, which is important.
Unfortunately, also the Berlin CDU demands the same with 80 cents.
Who is demanding that?
The coalition partner, indeed.
But since we do not agree and we have the department, it will not happen. So he can demand what he wants.
Inshallah, you say, okay, very good, let's see what happens. But Özgür, one of your areas of expertise is also social media and the presence of parties on social media, especially the AfD on TikTok. It was very surprising to me when I saw Maximilian Král, who in one of his videos explained, "We are comrades in arms with the Turks," which is interesting. Erdogan represents the interests of his country, of course, he is a good leader. But why don't we want him? Because our government does not dare to stand up for Germany's interests? How does the AfD actually target German Turks on TikTok specifically?
This is a wonderful example of how they do it. It started last summer, that is summer of 2023, and it is, well, they try to do it in a way that is specific to the community, working with the technological state and character of a platform. But it is a very important point that this does not only take place in the digital space. There are also positions in the analog space for which they have a very good sense and understanding, namely to say, yes, there are always conflicts between different migration generations, or there can be conflicts between them. Namely that some say, when I came, everything was much harder. I worked hard and earned something, and those who come now get this and that for free, which is unfair. This is something that exists globally, regardless of social context. And we have now, of course, within various communities. We have it in the Turkish origin communities as well. But we also have it for communities of Russian origin. They say, for example, we had to give up our language, which was very difficult for us. We had to adapt ourselves and work very hard. And now these people come and get a lot of things very easily. Community orientation, they are allowed to keep their languages. They also feel this is unfair, and this is exploited by those who want to pursue an old migration policy. That they say, here, we will take you with us, because we are also against them keeping their language and cultural practices. They should not be allowed to. And they advertise this by saying they are for different communities creating different messages, because they have a good sense of which positions, not the entire community, but parts of it, that are at least conservative in their positions, to catch them with an anti-migration stance, but also with an anti-immigration stance, anti-green, anti-establishment position. And this is also done by the alliance of Sarah Wagenknecht. They have now discovered a niche for themselves. Not just the migration issue, as it is already dominated by the AfD. They communicate on TikTok mainly, but also very aggressively on other social media, promoting a pro-Gaza stance. And this aligns with the general rhetoric that they are a supposed peace party, even regarding Russia's attack on Ukraine. And they do this with very aggressive pro-Gaza statements. They try to portray themselves as the only party covering this specific niche.
Yes. Is this the right way? How would you view this from a scientific perspective? Is it right for politicians to use polarizing, emotional statements as this aligns with social media algorithms? Is that actually right? Should one do that?
I would remove polarizing. I would first say elected officials should enter this space because until a few months ago, about 60%, the AfD had about 70% market share on TikTok compared to other political parties. This is a scenario that would never be acceptable in the physical world. In the physical world, we don't have a media environment that is controlled by the AfD to such a large extent, accounting for 70%. This stands in stark contrast to their electoral successes and their proportions of votes. This means we, or elected officials, must enter this space to challenge and contest the market shares. But this will be very difficult because this party has become highly professional and knows exactly what strategies work. And this polarizing approach is not necessarily a requirement to communicate on TikTok. There are strategies, and it is the responsibility of democratic parties to implement them, to invest resources, because this is a place where young people say they now experience their political socialization. So no longer in an analog world, but in a digital world, they experience political socialization. We know that many people, especially young people, now use TikTok not only as a platform, they use the For You page not just for consumption, but also as a research tool. Instead of going to Google, they go on TikTok, search for something, and then watch the related video. These are the realities of young people's lives, and therefore, democratic parties cannot stay out of this. It is their duty to engage with reasonable resource allocation.
And the parties naturally address specific migrant groups. For instance, when we talk about the AfD, I found it interesting that they appeal to many German Turks or migrants who have internalized racism, thinking, oh, they will deport the Syrians, but not us. They will deport the Syrians, but not us. So the problem with racism towards Arabs and from Turks and against Turks, in other words, is a different matter, which we can't discuss here. However, the Syrian community, for example, criticizes the German government or Germany in general, saying the West behaves hypocritically. Russia was boycotted when it bombed Syria, and no one said anything. But with Ukraine, everyone was immediately politically involved, they say, and thus they identify with the AfD because of this. For those of Iranian descent, it's the anti-Muslim sentiments that the AfD appeals to, and for the Russian Germans, it's likely because I wasn't really familiar with this, but because in Russia they were discriminated against for their German identity, they then came to Germany and were not really acknowledged with their national pride, except by the AfD, with this national pride of being German, accepted. These are very interesting, different and specific approaches to the community.
Exactly. The AfD often makes pro-Russian statements in public. In other words, it's also a party platform. This means it is also a party platform, so it's not surprising that they focus on these specific topics to fish for support. And they do this on social media, knowing they can specifically target certain people with specific traits and tailor the message to specific communities.
So I believe it's very important to reach more people, and when I'm here at Kotti, which is part of my constituency, I travel all over, going door to door, approaching people, listening to them, speaking with them. I believe it is very important that we as politicians meet the people where they are and engage with them, and to really listen to their concerns, because people with migration backgrounds in this constituency often feel unseen and unheard, and for them it is a total surprise when a politician comes to their door, talks with them, discusses many problems, clarifies issues, addresses concerns. People with migration backgrounds are 3 times more more likely to be affected by poverty than others, and I think it is crucial to link the issues of affordable housing and social justice to instances of marginalization and prejudice in order to convey the message that I acknowledge and understand your struggles, and I strive to make a difference and truly represent them. I believe it is crucial not only for people with migration backgrounds, but for democracy as a whole. We must move away from political disenchantment, reach people more effectively, tell them they have rights. There are many opportunities, and yes, there are problems, but we are working on them. Let's try together to develop proposals on how we can move forward in Germany. On the other hand, not everything is bad, and that should also be discussed. We often give voice to negative things, but positive things sometimes get overlooked. There are many improvements, and overall, this is a democratic and wealthy country compared to many others. It is even more important that we also see that there is poverty and that we fight it. I believe we need to address this social issue more strongly, be present locally and take care of it. Be present and thus also strengthen our democracy.
Andre, are you interested in pursuing a career in politics once more?
I have
To solve these kinds of problems?
no ambitions at this moment. I believe that engaging in conversations with people is very important. I consider this global focus to be very, very important, and I believe that science is a crucial topic. I think that science seldom wins elections, but it is extremely important to discover in surveys why people decide as they do. So, our next step is to have a conversation with them, followed by conducting and assessing the survey to determine the reasons behind it. This is an inquiry that truly captivates me. How the support among people with migration backgrounds was so strong in this election for the AfD as well, and I'm very curious about what will come out of it, and I consider it a very important point, yes. Orkan.
I believe that communicating political content to the masses has never been as easy as it is in this era. Some parties do this very well. As we know, for instance, the right-wing extremists. What really pains me to see is that this opportunity to communicate broadly is hardly utilized by the democratic parties. And then it's also about agenda setting. The democratic parties do not set the agenda. They are chasing the agenda of the right-wing extremists. And ultimately, one must simply say, there is also a bit of a lack of vision. We now have a politics without vision. So, when you think of Willy Brandt, when you think of the great minds, they always had a vision. They could stand at the podium and say, I wish for a Germany this and that, and then they could elaborate on that vision. And I believe that at the moment, no democratic party can do that at all, because they are only reacting. And that is, I believe, the big advantage, so to speak, of the AfD. They use the situation because they only react. They can set the agenda and others react to it. We need to move away from that.
Özgür, moment.
What do you think?
I was about to say, so far we haven't had an ambulance or anything, but this is Kreuzberg, that's normal.
It was really good for me.
Let's wait a moment.
We know our neighborhood.
Yes, we know our Kotti.
Let's wait for a short while.
We still need to stop by Komsu. Visions hold great significance to me and will be addressing it shortly, prior to discussing Orkan's mentioned topic of interest. What is very unique due to social media, especially because of TikTok's recommendation algorithm, is in the past, when big visions were shared, there was an analog channel for that. You enter a media public space and then you need a message that, especially as a major party, reaches many people. And that is now the difference. I can have a core message, but I can adapt it to specific communities. And why is this relevant? Because population forecasts show that half of this country will be of migrant background by 2030. Half of this society. This signifies a reversal of majority relationships. Consequently, we can declare this as absurd and voice our grievances, which we are more than willing to do. As citizens of Germany, complaining is something we delight in. National sport, but as a democracy that wants to maintain its liberal democracy, we are responsible for developing ideas, because a vision also means creating ideas on how to elevate communities in this society so that they become more relevant. And in my opinion, we cannot afford to ignore them, as Elif already mentioned, so they feel seen for the first time only when someone knocks on their door during a campaign. We must now simply focus on community-centered federal and state policies, because that is what the demographics of this country demand and require. And regarding demographics, it is crucial, as we discussed young people earlier, this demographic issue. For 20, 30 years we've talked about demographic change. Now it's here. We live in an aging and shrinking society, and such a society cannot afford to ignore such matters. When it comes to preserving democracy, to ignore communities. Community-oriented policies must be implemented. That is what these times, the 20s and 30s, will require.
This applies equally to the media landscape. You bring it up, 38% of those under 20 years old also have a migration background, and especially the public broadcasters lack a clear vision on how to reach these target groups, but that's why we are having this discussion. And now you have the final word, Emitis.
Our society is unfortunately divided, and I truly wish that our society would come closer together, that we support each other more, and cultural sensitivity is certainly an issue, but we live in a globalized world, and unfortunately this cannot be prevented, and I wish that the politicians would also look more at neighboring countries. In Scandinavia or Canada, they serve as great examples for understanding how integration and migration policies are effectively implemented. Let us draw inspiration from them, see how digitalization works there and educational issues. Let us also implement these things. I also wish that politicians wouldn't disappear from the public eye after they win elections. I often see that, but also sometimes just listen carefully and look at society, taking the problems of the population more seriously and acknowledging them properly, so that such statements from AfD voters do not happen anymore, so they are truly seen and recognized more. So we as the population, not their own interests, are always at the forefront. That's what I wish from politicians.
May I say a word about Canada? In Canada, I was there the year before last. I visited a mosque in Canada, specifically in Toronto. This mosque has its own kindergarten, an elementary school, and also a high school. And these children go through the entire system in this mosque and then attend university, most of them at the University of Toronto, to study. I think we can't even imagine this in our specific context, because we would immediately say, oh my God, what is happening there? And that is also Canada.
Because the foundation was laid wrong here. But what I really appreciate in Canada is that you are not seen and asked, where do you come from? In Germany, you always have to justify where you come from and what you have achieved. I am German, accept that. Just as you said earlier, I am German, but in Germany, you always have to justify yourself, while in Canada, you can say, I am Canadian, and you won't be questioned. Why? Do you originally come from somewhere else, perhaps? That is the foundation, and we can still build on that in Germany. There is a need, and we can change a lot, but it must come from politics, much from politics.
And I think it's good that we can discuss these topics together in this group. That is important, and what matters to me is not convincing you to vote for any party. I really don't care. You can vote for whoever you want. This is a democratic country, and you have the right to do so. Other political parties must win you over. That is not my job at all. But what matters to me is that you make your decisions consciously when you go to vote in about a year and a half. That you have information on which you base these decisions. That's why it was important to me that we have this episode. Here in Koti, we are filming this particular format where we discuss our various problems, issues that concern us directly, but also issues that affect everyone collectively. Therefore, I want to express my gratitude to all of you for taking the time, and it was probably a new experience for you to film on the street. Many heartfelt thanks for that, and also thanks to everyone for watching. Until we meet again next time, goodbye.